A pleasure to meet y'all at last, and welcome back to Films I'm Willing to Talk About Again. This one is in fact going to be about a special Tom Hanks film. One that is of course a satire amongst satires. 1999's The Green Mile. So in any case, I urge that you sit back and relax because this one is quite a doozy. Mostly by an emotional spectrum. What we can determine from this of all Tom Hanks films that had existed throughout the late 90s, at least in comparison to what we've gotten to know about Sleepless in Seattle, the Toy Story films, and many others that had existed throughout this period. Yet Tom Hanks' acting career was a bit more significant throughout this time, especially after the amazing success of the first Toy Story film. Not to mention The Money Pit, and who could ever forget about Turner and Hooch, which I've talked a bit about before, so that's pretty much there if you want to go watch it. But in any case though, The Green Mile is in fact the one story about a convicted African American individual who has been sentenced to death by the electric chair. And so, it is basically the story of how one person had died thanks to an execution backed by capital punishment in the States. Just looking at it and just reminiscing about how it went is really saddening to know. Because just to know the fact that capital punishment is still a huge deal these days sure is quite a waste of our time. And it just proves the fact that a lot of people would rather not be humane. Just because people have turned into monsters doesn't mean we should treat them like monsters, and they deserve the most painful thing to ever feel. To force them to feel pain like the others have in their whole lives is not necessarily the way to go. And what this film actually gives us is something that's probably more depressing to look at, and even more so when it comes to just understanding how amazingly well put together everything is. You got the casting lined up, of course. You have the plot line worked out. You have the score. And who could, of course, forget about the directing and producing jobs? Of course, I could go all day talking about all of those things individually, but the whole point is that, well, it's a bit of a simple plot line, much like how I've spoken about in Gravity. Whereas it's just one thing, as opposed to 1,000 things that you could probably get in a bunch of other films out there. With films that are massive successes like Ghostbusters, Transformers, Jaws, Jurassic Park, E.T., and many others out there, there's always a good chance that the plot can become more complicated, more complex, but at least not to the point where they can become very confusing, hard to understand, or hard to take in all at once. Yet with this, it's a bit too simple. It's about a guy who gets sentenced to death by the electric chair, and the whole film is basically a bit of a drawn-out sequence of things that happen prior to the actual death that happens. From the moment that the guy gets sentenced in court, all the way up to the very point near the end of the film, where the guy's head is shaven, and he's strapped to the chair, and plugged up with thousands of volts. Which back then could kill a person. These days though, we have taken on lots more voltage than that. So again, this is just basically my premonition of how films can be way too simple and therefore they're not necessarily worth their own merits. Even if you could take it in for everything else other than the whole sequence of events that happened throughout this whole film, it's just not really that interesting to look at all the time. Or maybe even just once. So in any case though, that's just all I have to talk about with this one here. So if you want to see more of that on my channel, then make sure that you like, subscribe, comment, follow me on social media, and stay on the Hollywood side.